And this is how it connects us.
私たちをつなぐ。
We believe in helping people find a way to get things done. We call this Africanacity.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Bohani Hlungwani. I am head of trade and working capital sales in the APSA group within the CIB business. You've joined us today for an exciting session, an exciting webinar on the value of trade and infrastructure in Africa's economic development. I'm not alone today. I am with a few panelists that I'll give an opportunity to introduce themselves in a few minutes. I just want to make a few remarks, opening remarks around the free trade area, around some of the issues around infrastructure, and some of the issues around economic development in the continent. One, I think, central to this question that we're trying to address today is the fact that the African countries, a few years back, decided, which was actually a culmination of a number of years of negotiations, to formulate a free trade agreement, a free trade area agreement, which essentially aims at achieving a few objectives. Amongst those objectives is the creation of a single market, one single market, which comprises over 1 billion people plus trillions of dollars, so that instead of outside parties dealing with one country that is worth $30 million or so forth, with at least 5 million people, you're now looking at trillions of dollars and a billion plus people. That's one of the objectives of the free trade area. The second one being improving the competitiveness of the regional economic bloc as Africa, so that, you know, as the continent were able to develop not just the economic conditions, but also the individual conditions of the people in the African continent, to benefit from the resources that are in Africa, to benefit from the economic growth within our continent. The third objective is the increase of the intra-Africa trade as a proportion of total Africa trade, which sits anywhere between 17 and 20%, depending on what report you're reading. When you do that, of course, and you push that up to, you know, higher numbers, you ensure that a lot of the value that is created within the African continent is then traded within the African continent and benefiting the countries, benefiting the economies, and benefiting the individuals. So in essence, that's what the free trade area it's meant to achieve. It's divided into two phases. Phase one being the trade of goods and services, and then phase two goes into other issues around competition commission and so forth. Some of the dependencies around goods and services, and before I get to that, for those that may not be aware, we went live with a free trade area on the 1st of January this year, which basically means that trading can commence. There are a few key issues, though, that are still being looked at or being dealt with. One is the ratification of the agreement by all governments, all parliaments in Africa. And by the last time, I think we were at plus 30, plus 34 countries that had done so. The second issue, which is quite important, it's an agreement on or depositing the schedule of tariffs on which zero tariffs will be applicable on 90% of those goods. And by last count, once again, I think over 30 countries had also done that. The third issue that is quite important to make sure that we've closed on, it's the question of complete alignment on what rules of origin means in the context of the free trade area. That's important in as far as making sure that the free trade area, it's not then abused by other regions or other countries whereby they add value, let's say up to 90%, and then bring the goods into Africa, and so that it starts to, for further trading within the continent, so that it enjoys the right benefits or the benefits that we've already spoken about. There are two other additional issues that are quite important that I want to highlight in the context of our discussion today. One is the fact that, of course, tariff barriers are quite important, but in the execution of trade, the movement of trade between countries, so are non-tariff barriers. And in this regard, there's a lot of efforts that have been put by the African Union and the Commission in making sure that there are digital platforms that are used for the recording and the monitoring of this and the gradual reduction of that. The other important issue, it's the question of infrastructure, to say, do we have the adequate infrastructure today to be able to enable the free movement of goods in terms of rail infrastructure, in terms of roads infrastructure, in terms of digital infrastructure, and any other form of infrastructure? And how critical is infrastructure development in this agenda of making sure that we can drive Africa's regional economic story? So if you're looking at trade and say, I think if you look at the development of other regions and the development of the world economy, we can see that trade development is quite critical and quite key and central to driving an economic regional integration story. In addition to that, the other question then becomes, how critical is infrastructure development? So these are some of the questions that I think are worth pondering on. Now, having given you that brief overview of what the free trade area is and some of the challenges that we're sitting with, I do want to highlight a few challenges that we should not be naive to, that we will use this session to interrogate. There's questions around the complexity of the underlying tariff infrastructure and how we then, or how long it takes for us to get to a certain point to make sure that there's full alignment amongst the countries that are party to the free trade areas. There's the question of economic inclusivity. It's an important issue that we should not, deny in terms of making sure that any benefits that starts to accrue into the African continent as a result of this is benefit that accrues to all other parties that are important. It's important as well to talk about the fact that there's also a history of multiple agreements, multiple issues that in the past, or multiple initiatives that in the past have been undertaken by the African leaders, and why some of those have failed, and how that kind of skepticism can creep in to say, you talk about these being the largest free trade area since the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1994. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of some of these challenges that we were pointing out here. So in essence, these and many others, in terms of saying, if infrastructure is critical, how do we finance that? So these are some of the issues that, together with my fellow distinguished panelists, will seek to interrogate, will seek to prosecute today. And I look forward to that. And thank you very much once again for joining us. As I indicated, I'm then going to move across to our fellow panelists to introduce themselves and then give a few introductory remarks. Once they've done that, and we have 3 panelists, once they've done that, I will then, I've got a number of questions that I'm going to then pose to them to be able to deal some of these issues that we've already been talking to, and some of the issues that will come up. On that note, let me now give over to Alan first to introduce himself and give a few introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bahani. Thank you for that very comprehensive introduction. My name is Alan Naraidu, and I work at the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is the investment insurance guarantee agency of the World Bank Group. And what we do is we provide long-term investment guarantees into the private sector space, and of particular interest is infrastructure and the providing of long-term guarantees for investors and lenders who are investing into the infrastructure space. And when we talk about infrastructure, it's a very broad definition. We're talking about roads, we're talking about railways, ports, we talk about telecommunications, we're talking about energy access. So it's a very comprehensive set of sectors that we cover, and also very relevant to the continent within the context of the free trade agreement. Now, against the backdrop of COVID, what I've certainly seen over the last couple of months, and certainly since the beginning of January 2020, when the pandemic really took hold globally, is that there's a substantial decline in FDI and real sector investment. There's also a substantial decline in lending. Now, this substantial decline in investment in real sector engagement, coupled by the systemic risk that several countries in Africa have historically experienced, being low GDP rates, lack of capital and labor mobility, debt sustainability, limited access to capital, economies that are not really fully diverse. The COVID really sort of impacted this, and and really severely, in my mind, sort of set the clock back for many countries on the continent. So the question now becomes, how do we rebalance that, and how do we get back on track? And this is why I think the free trade agreement, which talks to a single market, which talks to a potential market of 1.3 billion people, is a very important discussion. But coupled with the single market is you really need the backbone of trade and industry, is really infrastructure. And you need connected infrastructure, and you need efficient infrastructure. Now, if you look at the continent, I mean, the continent is very dependent on commodities. It's very dependent on tourism. So connected infrastructure is very important. We need to look at infrastructure that can mobilize secondary activities. I mean, we work in a continent that's commodity rich, yet there's very limited secondary activities and actually benefiting those commodities in refining capacity, in transport infrastructure that can use various transport nodes to get product out to neighboring countries and also international countries. So infrastructure is really the backbone to provide diversification and to provide efficient connectivity, not only between the respective countries on the continent, but also to international markets to make the continent more competitive. Now, in addition, so the whole sort of diversification is, I think, in my mind, a very important topic that we need to build into the narrative. In addition to that, we need to be cognizant of climate change, and whatever infrastructure we build or we consider, we need to ensure that it's consistent with the climate change agenda, and very importantly, we need to ensure that there's proper mitigation and adaptation technologies built into the infrastructure, because climate change is a reality, and the potential for Africa to be impacted by climate change is very significant. So things like diversification from fossil fuels, things like renewable energy become very important for the discussion as we look at the various types of infrastructure, as we look at energy, as we look at energy access, as we look at transport infrastructure. We need to also keep in mind the climate agenda. So on those opening remarks, I'm looking forward to a very robust discussion. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And with that, I'll hand back to Bahani. Thanks, Bahani.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think the issues that you have highlighted in your introductory remarks, the fact that we need to think broadly about what infrastructure means, right? Oftentimes people think about infrastructure and we think about road and rail infrastructure, but actually, as you indicated, we need to think broadly about that, and we need to think about connectedness. And you've introduced quite an interesting aspect of that as well, in terms of being cognizant of climate change as we move into the next phase of our development. And I think that takes us straight to our next panelist, because if we're talking infrastructure development, all kinds of infrastructure, we'll probably have to talk about financing as well. So Leslie, please introduce yourself and give a few of your remarks. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Bohani. Good afternoon, listeners. My name is Leslie Bradley. I'm the corporate director for ABSA Botswana, and for us, we are very excited to be talking about Africa trade and how we interlock the countries to ensure that corporates get goods a lot faster and they are able to manage their costs quite effectively. But for us, trade is a key and long-term success and sustainable economic growth for Sub-Sahara. It's absolutely key. And if it transforms and improves the lives and livelihoods of Africans. If you're to think about how Africa participates in the global trade agenda, we only contribute to 3% of total world trade. 3%. And it's mind-boggling to imagine why we're sitting at 3% when we have, you know, an abundance of resources in Africa, ranging from, be it cotton, copper, you know, commodities, whether it's fuel, whether it's diamonds, you know, it's in abundance, and yet we still contribute to only 3% of the world trade. And you know, studies have been shown that should we just increase that by 1%, we would actually increase Africa's revenues by $70 billion US. Just 1%, moving it by 1%, we'll be able to increase it by $70 billion dollars into Africa. And can you imagine what that will do to most of the economies, what that will do towards contributing to the infrastructure development that we're talking about today? So for me, coming from Botswana, I've seen how, you know, if a country manages its resources effectively, and how it can actually benefit the livelihoods of a number of people across. And it would be very interesting to see how we do that across Africa through the interlocking that Bohane spoke about, through opening up borders and all that. You know, we were just talking about a scenario just yesterday. If you look at Senegal, Senegal surrounds the Gambia. Senegal trades, biggest trading partner is France. Gambia's biggest trading partner is the UK. And you wonder, one is within the other. Why are they not trading together? It's like asking Lesotho to go and trade with Australia. So I think for us, those are the questions, fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves and see how we unlock those opportunities. So very exciting session, Bohane, and we're looking forward to unpacking it further. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Leslie. Great insights that you've shared with us. I like the words you used to say we can use trade to transform and improve the lives of the African people. And given this knowledge that we actually already know, we already have this knowledge. We know the value of trading with each other. And yet at the same time, you mentioned some very concerning statistics. You know that a lot of us in the trade space and in the financing space have been aware or are aware of, which is the fact that we only account for 3% of total global trade. You also indicated what I think is a very important point in my view, to say if we are resource rich, as we are significantly, why is it that those resources are not traded mostly within the African continent? It's a critical question that I hope, as we unpack a lot of these issues today, we'll get answers to some of these things. And I think the next panelist is best positioned even to shed even more light into why this situation is the way that it is. And I'm going to ask Trevor to come in and introduce himself, even as he gives his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Bohane. Thank you very much, Bohane, and a good afternoon and good morning to those who are in a different time zone. You know, with this new you don't know who is listening and who's watching and where they are. So you know, you have people it's morning, you have people it's evening, and in Africa, Central Africa time, it's afternoon. I think this webinar has come at the right time, and it's good to see a Pan-African, a global bank, but more of a Pan-African bank, ABSA, the ABSA group being part of this kind of dialogue, because this is what we actually need in order to push Africa's integration forward. In terms of my introductory remarks, I think I want to provide a historical perspective so that people can understand that this process of regional economic integration did not just start now. This is something that Africa has believed in and has pushed from the time of independence, from the 60s, when countries such as Ghana, Zambia, Nigeria, and many other, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and many other African countries began to decolonize and become independent countries. And so the OAU was born in 1963, the Organization of African Unity. However, the OAU in the beginning was much more focused on decolonization and political cooperation amongst the newly independent African states. And there was a huge drive at that time in Africa as a whole by the African countries for what were known as import substitution policies. So basically, a lot of these African countries wanted to be able to produce the products that they were hitherto importing, having them produced nationally. But this led to a lot of what would call a complementary situation where you find that a country like Zambia, for instance, even though they may not have the competitive advantage, but because they want to also have a motor industry, for instance, set up motor assembly plants, okay, which today, if you go around in most of the countries, are basically dead. Only South Africa, Morocco, to a certain extent, and Kenya still have a set of a motor industry. So by the late 80s, countries became of integration, of cooperation, of trade amongst each other to improve Africa's intra-Africa trade, but also to improve Africa's access to the external market. However, when we look at what has happened over the years, today Africa has more regional organizations than any other continent. All right? Most of the African countries are members of more than one regional economic community. If you look at the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980 for the formation of an African common market by the year 2000. Obviously, this we have not achieved, but at least we have now achieved a free trade area. Then in 1991, the Abuja Treaty established formally the African Economic Community. And this is when the notion of regional economic communities was put in place in terms of Africa. And the current designated regional economic communities are the Arab Maghreb Union, ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, ECAS, which is the Economic Community of Central African States, COMESA, which is the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, SADC, Southern Africa Development Community, the East African Community, the Community of Saharan States, and IGAD, which is the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, which brings together many countries in the Horn of Africa, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and these others. So these are currently the 8 regional economic communities that are working towards a regional African economic community. Now, with the establishment of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we now have a real opportunity to actually drive regional economic integration at a much faster rate. However, there is still a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. Even within the negotiations of free trade area, we're still negotiating trade incentives. We still have to finalize the rules of origin, which is very critical to free trade. You cannot have free trade without agreed rules of origin to ensure that the benefits of free trade actually accrue to the African countries that are members of that free trade area. You know, we have to look at issues of movement of people, free movement of people. We're still struggling with that across Africa. And more importantly, the interconnections. You know, today it is much easier and much faster to bring in goods or take goods out of Africa into Europe, into America, into Asia, China and India, than it is to move products from South Africa to Nigeria, for example, or even within West Africa, just to move products from Nigeria to Ghana, or, you know, from West Africa to North Africa. There is very little interconnectedness. And even where there is connections, because of poor infrastructure at our borders, you know, because of reasons of unharmonized policies and processes, it is very difficult for traders to actually move across the borders and conduct a business. So I think it will be important as we talk about infrastructure and the interconnectedness, that we must realize that the reality of doing business in Africa is very different from the ideals that we have put in place. And so it's important for African member states, African Union member states, to commit fully to ensuring that we can begin to harmonize, we can begin to make it easy for Africans themselves to trade with each other. It is not government that is going to do business with other governments. It is you and I, citizens of Africa, companies that are in Africa that have to do this, that have to move across the borders, have to face the reality of dealing with public officials and other bureaucratic processes. So if we can make it as easy as possible for business to do business, I think then we'll be moving in the direction that Africa needs to. And the process of integration will become much faster, much quicker, and much more effective, and see Africa's share in global trade increase. But more importantly, intra-African trade must also increase. Let me just end by saying that the African Union has actually an action plan for boosting intra-Africa trade. The first successful achievement of that action plan has been the establishment of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. That's a key pillar of the action plan. But the action plan doesn't just talk about trade. The action plan has 7 key clusters, namely trade facilitation, trade policy, factor market integration, trade-related infrastructure, this is what we're discussing today, trade finance, trade information, and trade information, that's the last cluster. So all these clusters are still part of the action plan. And I would appeal to the private sector in Africa that reach out to the African Union. The African Union is very open to working with the private sector so that you can help us drive this process and ensure that we facilitate and coordinate across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Very knowledgeable contribution there, Trevor, an economist within the African continent. I think there are a lot of issues that the panelists have touched on. Just a reminder that you can also ask questions through the platform, and hopefully we can be able to get those also addressed by the panelists. I do want to go a little bit. So we've spoken about interconnectedness. We talked about infrastructure. Trevor, you've also talked about the fact that there are 8 regional economic communities that enjoy some level of trade liberalization, varying levels of trade liberalization. You've also touched on, various aspects of regional integration, and Leslie has touched on a number of issues around, the fact that we are resource rich as a continent, and despite that, we've got very limited intra-Africa trade and limited trade. We've touched on the fact that you're talking about 1 billion plus people, you're talking about trillions of dollars of an economy, and Alan has touched on the fact that these are infrastructures across different kinds of infrastructure. And my first question, therefore, is to Alan. Given all of these things that we've touched on, right? What are the lessons that we can and must learn from other regions with respect to both infrastructure and trade, implementation of the free trade area, and driving the economic agenda in as far as the region is concerned?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Bahani. I think really sort of starting at the top, you really need political certainty and you need political buy-in. You really need to drive any type of cross-border significant infrastructure investment. You need agreement at the top. If I look at some of the activities that we are involved in for instance, I'm looking at a transport node, for instance, in Guinea and Liberia, which is potentially going to be using shared infrastructure between those two countries to export iron ore. You have buy-in at the top. You have buy-in at the presidential level. Once you have buy-in at the top, you then need policy and regulation certainty, right? To bring in investors, to create an environment where lenders, the likes of APSA, can support projects. Because without consistent regulation, without consistent certainty, and the ability to implement the political intent of the leadership, you're not going to see successful projects, right? So if you look at projects that have been successful in the infrastructure space, and especially those projects that utilize cross-border type arrangements, you have the political will, you have the regulation certainty, which creates then the enabling environment. I think the third point that we need to be cognizant of is that the infrastructure projects that's put forward to mobilize and to catalyze both investors and other participants, stakeholders who are going to use the infrastructure, needs to actually make sense. You don't want a situation where you have a large infrastructure project just for the sake of having it. You need to be very thoughtful in how you position the infrastructure, how you position your critical infrastructure network, so you have the commercial economies of scale. You can scale things up, so you can draw finance into it. So at the end of the day, it's very important that it actually makes good commercial sense. I think for me, those are the sort of key attributes that you've got to consider. I mean, you've also, I think it's also very important that you mobilize the likes of the IFI, so you can have the cross-border political conversations between the various political constituencies. And once you get these various parties to the table, that's the sort of basic ingredients to have a meaningful conversation around a successful regional development.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alan. Some key insights there once again. Buy-in from the top, clarity in terms of the infrastructure, focused infrastructure spend that we need to have. Leslie, infrastructure keeps coming up, obviously, and to say that you can talk about all these benefits of trade. You can talk about the fact that we are resource rich. We can talk about the fact that we know that we need to have the infrastructure, digital, transport, and many more. And we know what we need to do. I suppose naturally, therefore, there are costs and financing challenges associated with the financing of this infrastructure. What are the challenges of financing infrastructure that we currently have in the continent, which, if not addressed, probably would make the bigger regional integration project quite challenging. And how do we overcome those?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bohani. It's a very great question. I think one that we all need to kind of think about, because that's what will open up the doors to the interconnected trade that we are talking about. But giving some context, it is estimated that Sub-Sahara alone needs $93 billion to finance its infrastructure deficit. And most of these infrastructure classes cover energy, road, rail, and water infrastructure. So you can agree with me, these are key for us to deliver this program. But on the other side, I think it's also very humbling, to know that, infrastructure investment in Africa has been increasing steadily over the past 15 years. And international investors have increased their appetite, but they have also set aside funds to deliver and back up these potential projects. However, you did indicate that there are challenges, and I think Alan spoke about those as well. Africa's track record in moving projects to financial closure is poor. And according to McKinsey, 80% of the infrastructure projects fail at feasibility or business planning stage. So it's a bit of a concern. So we need to then say what's creating that. And one is insufficient political will. We have challenges obtaining licenses, approvals, permits, and some of the key challenges that were already raised. And then the other one is there's limited public sector capability. So government at times has the will to do these projects, but do they have capability, in-house capability to actually deliver these? And in a lot of times, they don't, and this leads to weak feasibility studies and business planning. The other one is inability to secure offtake agreements and guarantees. And I hope Maskwakwa is on this call, because that there's a will to say yes, we have to deliver this, and then as financial institutions, when you want guarantees, we're told no, we're no longer issuing guarantees. And when you then ask for offtake agreements, they're still going between a number of government offices before they're finalized. And this we saw coming quite strongly in the IPP space. There's also an inability to agree on risk allocation, and this is where Alan also comes in. I like the fact that they've now thought of, bringing in the likes of MEGA to help de-risk some of the issues we see. And there's also policy uncertainty across a lot of markets. So some developed markets, some are still trying to figure out what it is they want to do. And there's also a weak regulatory environment in some of the markets, which is something that we really need to work on. And how do we overcome these? I think we need to really consider how we improve the flow of private sector funding into commercially viable infrastructure projects. So that's something that we need to do. Government can't do it alone. We need to say, how do we bring in private sector funding into commercially viable infrastructure projects? So that's one. And then the second step is, how do we consider reallocating government funding to prevent crowding out public sector? And I know in our market, there's an outcry to say, government seems to want to do everything. And I think for us, we need to say, why don't we get government to do the less commercially viable projects? And I'll give you an example. Within the CBD area, or even within the old CBD, we don't have enough parking. No entity is going to put up a parking lot, but government through the city councils can pick up those projects. So those are the things we need to be doing. And thirdly, we need to establish how we strengthen collaboration with national and multinational institutions. And this is where they can provide us with critical skills, where it involves, structuring the transactions, planning for the projects to make sure that we reach closure. And the other one, it's usually, amongst others, how do we establish a solid legal and regulatory framework and guarantee its enforcement and stability? And I know in Africa, it continues to be a bit of a challenge. So those are the kind of key points that I would like us to think about. And we also need to formulate an integrated infrastructure plan that creates a steady pipeline of projects, so that we complete one and there's one coming along. We don't wait until the costs become so unaffordable for us to actually undertake most of these projects. So I really believe there are ways that private sector can come in to help in project development and infrastructure funding, but I'll leave that to a later discussion during the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Quite comprehensive list. And, Trevor, one of the things that, as I'm listening to Leslie, what I'm picking up is varying degrees of maturities in terms of the various markets are impacting our ability to actually successfully implement projects, infrastructure projects, which are quite key to actually enabling trade and growing the regional economies. Naturally, therefore, because you'd have a South Africa, you have a Morocco or a Kenya that may be more developed than a Central African Republic or a Benin, and so forth. I think the question to you, Trevor, will be, given this reality and already an acceptance that these things are not options for us, we have to drive them. We have to drive them in order to drive our economic agenda and Africa's development. How can Africa avoid the free trade area in particular, and some of these aspects that we've been debating? How can Africa avoid that benefiting only the big economies?
Yes, that's a particularly important issue and a question. It is something that has actually slowed down regional integration in Africa, because if you look at all the 8 regional economic communities I mentioned, there is at least 1 or 2 major economies within that regional grouping, and which causes a lot of tension, in fact, in particular political tension, because there is always a view that the real beneficiaries of increased regional liberalization of trade is the bigger economy. So in Southern Africa, we talk about South Africa. In East Africa, we are looking at Kenya. If you go to West Africa, you're looking at about 3 countries, actually, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and to a large extent now, because of the growth of its economy, Ghana as well is beginning to be seen as an outlier in terms of development. That is a much bigger economy, so they're going to benefit more. You go to North Africa, you've got Egypt, you've got Morocco. You come into Central Africa, you've got the dominance of the DRC in terms of resource availability, not necessarily that they are dominating trade, but in terms of the resource that you find in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also in Congo Brazzaville in terms of the oil and all this, there's that dominance. So one of the, I think the key issues is that we have to be open about it and be able to incorporate adjustment costs. And this is something that operated even in the continental free trade area. It's also incorporated in the African Union the Abuja Treaty that established the African Economic Community, there is an aspect of adjustment cost, being able at the regional level to compensate countries that may be much more negatively affected by the liberalization, and to allow them an opportunity and time to be able to get to a level where they can compete quite well. We see it also in SADC. In SADC, we have preferential rules. We have preferential rules of origin to ensure that South Africa does not take up the bulk of the trade. So I think critical to that, as I say, is number one, we have to acknowledge that fact that there will be winners and losers in any regional integration process. You've seen what has happened even in a mature regional community, in Europe, with Britain leaving the European Union, and continued tension between the Southern European countries and the Western European countries, such as Germany on the one hand, Germany, France on the one hand, and then you've got Portugal, Spain, Greece, and on the other hand. So the reality of integration. But I think what is critical is for us to, as well, at other aspects of regional integration, especially when it comes to infrastructure. So we already have seen some successful regional projects in terms of infrastructure. In fact, way before, if we go back to the 70s, when you look at Tazara, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which was built with Chinese funding and technical support, that has been, and it still operates. And today it's providing a very good avenue for export of copper to China and to India. Okay, if you look today, modern, right now, Zambia and Botswana have just completed the Kazungula Bridge, which is going to be a fundamental bridge that will link Southern Africa to the rest of, to the East and Central Africa coming through Zambia, okay? We've also had a number of successful one-stop border projects that are Zambia, Zimbabwe, DR Zambia, Kasumbalesa, which is a very critical border, and that was done on, and all these were done on public-private partnership, all right? You've also got Kenya, Uganda, you've also got Tanzania and Zambia now also being done in Nakonde, you know? So we do have examples of regional collaboration. So I think we need to build on those, work using those, and where you help countries that are weaker is that, for example, Zambia and Zimbabwe, we already have legislation in both countries that enabled us to establish a one-stop border post. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If Zimbabwe and Botswana, for example, want to do a similar project, they simply take the model that is already there, rather than starting all over again. So this is where cooperation, harmonization of procedures and regulations helps. You know, so for example, South Africa, a very big role to help other African countries to understand how you structure public-private partnerships, how you privately finance a certain infrastructure. We've seen across the continent, countries are now using toll gates to get a return on investment in terms of roads. You know, there's a number of innovations that are going on around the world, and especially digitalization. That is why the African Union is developing a digital strategy for the continent, because digitalization, especially with COVID, has shown us that we can actually overcome a lot of our challenges by simply utilizing technology and leapfrogging from one level to the next.
Thank you, Trevor. Wow, this is such an exciting, discussion. I think we can actually discuss this for the next 3 hours. I do realize that we have run out of time even before we could actually talk about questions from the audience and some of the questions we're prepared for. But I do want to close. I'll give each of you a minute to just give your closing remarks, focusing in my view on, in your view, what are the top two things, just two of them. What are the top two things that must happen for the successful implementation of both the free trade area as well as the multiple infrastructure projects that are a requirement for us to drive the trade? Who should I start with? Let me start with Alan. A minute each.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bohani. Firstly, Jess, I think this is a very exciting, opportunity. The free trade agreement. I mean, it potentially becomes one of the largest free trade areas in the world. So it's not an opportunity that we should take lightly, or it's not an opportunity that we should miss. I think the top two success criteria that we need to actually enable this to move forward is we need a consistent and coherent political will across the member countries. We need regulation and policy consistency, and we need funding by both the private sector and the international IFIs.
Fantastic. Great. I think very clear, crisp. Leslie? In a minute.
Yeah, in a minute. I think for me, it's around the collaboration between public and private partnerships. We really need to harness those and ensure that they do happen. And then I think for me, it's around the infrastructure built. We really need to stop having railway lines that are all leading to the ports, but not leading to the different countries that should be moving commodities. I think for me, it's those two.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Trevor, in a minute, what are the top two?
Thank you. Yes, top two things. The first one is that we need, aligned with the free trade area, we need a continental industrial strategy that focuses on building our capacity to manufacture, particularly with these new industries. So I'm talking about solar panels, the lithium batteries, the new industries that are taking so much demand of our natural resources. We should start manufacturing those things here in Africa. That'll be number one thing that we need to do. So we need to we've got an industrial strategy, but I don't think it's the right one. It doesn't, it will not help us increase our share of global trade. So we need an industrialization that is based on these new industries, technology, the products that are being used in all these new industries. We need to begin to look at how we can manufacture those, create regional chains. We need to have regional value chains that cut across the continent. I think those two things are critical.
Thank you very much. This is exciting. I think there are challenges, but there are more opportunities. There are opportunities that exist because Africa as a continent, in my view, has never been ready. One, as ready as we are today. The private sector knows very well that the size of the size of a market like Africa, 1 billion plus people plus trillions of dollars, is hard to come by, unexplored in many ways. I think the creation of regional value chains is a great opportunity for all countries. And I think the starting point for me is, what is the country's competitive advantage, natural competitive advantage? So I do think that we've got great opportunities. The challenges exist, but I do think that in complementing political will, it's the business imperative that already exists for the multiple asset managers, investors, and many other capital players, industries, to be able to continue to earn a return. And Africa does present an opportunity. And I think as Africans and as industry, as financial institutions, as us as APSA and many other financial institutions, should look at these as opportunities where we say, what are the things we must do to be able to enable this growth? I think this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, is a conversation that would continue, and I believe it must continue in our own boardrooms, in our own meeting, office, in our own offices, at home, in radio, in the media, and we must look at this much more as an opportunity, and once in a life opportunity that would drive Africa's economic agenda. I think the issues that the panelists have raised, these are issues that can be dealt with. These are issues that present opportunities across governments, across industry, across regulators, across DFIs, across financial institutions, and so forth. And with those words, I'd like to bring to an end this webinar, and thank you very much for your attention, and thank the panelists for their excellent contribution. And I look forward to more engagement and more webinars that talk about this exciting topic. Thank you very much, and do have yourself a great afternoon and a great morning wherever you are. Thank you.
And this is how it connects us.
私たちをつなぐ。
We believe in helping people find a way to get things done. We call this Africanacity.